know exactly what things are going to be like here toward the end of October, but it looks like we are certainly right in the middle of some sort of collapse. And here we are only, 4 or 5 days away from the latest student council election. I've been saying this is a great step because we were talking last night at the board meeting, and Nathan said, this election is no more important than some locals' high school student council election. Thank you, Frank. I just had to steal that. And I'll explain a little bit later why we believe this. But, I think God's given us a great opportunity here, just like Pastor Weaver said this morning, Judgment is a good thing. God has promised His judgment upon those who oppose Him. And it's something we should welcome. And how should we, as Southerners, as individuals, as families, as communities, react to what's going on around us? Well, I want you to take these words to heart. You lock yourself up in cages of fear, and lo, you protest that you have no freedom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of death is the beginning of slavery. And before I get into the meat of my talk today, I want you to remember this. The penultimate act of a corrupt government is to loot its subjects. The penultimate act, the next to the last act of a corrupt government is to loot its subjects. The final act is to make war on them physically. Let that sink in. When we consider that position which we find this country today, including our beloved Southland, we're looking at a process that's been taking place now, not for weeks, not for days, weeks, or months, but for years. It's what we might liken to a chronic disease. Between the trivial and the colossal, there's the chronic. And that is how our masters like it. Because if you have a chronic disease like that, it's something that you kind of learn to live with, isn't it? It's not the colossal thing that all of a sudden overwhelms you, but it's certainly more than trivial. So there between the trivial on the one end and the colossal on the other end is that chronic state that we find ourselves in. Several conservatives, and every time I usually mention the word conservatives, it always elicits smiles and knowing grins and even laughter from League of the South people. Well, several conservatives I know warn me that we'll be living in a socialist country when Barack Obama is elected president next Tuesday. My reply to them was, we are already living in one under G.W. Bush and the Republicans. That's right. In fact, it's sometimes hard to tell if it's more socialist or more fascist. Or maybe it's just both. But I do understand what they mean by an Obama presidency. It will be bad. However, would it really be any different under John McCain? And League members always say no to that. No. These days, we would do well to dust off an old quote from the late Alabama Governor George Cornelius Wallace when he said, of course, there's not a Now, we're the difference between the Democrats and Republicans. You folks know all this stuff. The two major parties constitute separate wings of the same corrupt regime.
That's right.
The same organized criminal enterprise. Therefore, nothing important to the real power elite ever changes from one election to the other, and that's why Franklin Sanders called it a student council election. It doesn't matter, because the president, it really isn't powerful at all. Catherine told us this morning, they don't have any power. They're just sort of boxed in here. They don't have any power. So, even though the American president can exercise some power, they owe their positions ultimately to behind-the-scenes power brokers. These are what I will call generally the money men in finance and big business. I dare say that without the support of the money power, neither Obama nor McCain would get within sniffing distance of a party nomination, much less the White House itself. The same applies for all but a handful of U.S. congressmen and senators. As Dr. Clyde Wilson, our own scholar, says, Congress, and by all implications here, national politics in general, is like the market, or as Clyde says on his more risque days, like a brothel. Well, you can imagine that. In other words, a lot can be had if you got a little money. It can be manipulated if you have the money. Politicians no longer represent the people, the states, or that idea, the consent of the government. Rather, they represent the interest of their major financial sponsors. And if you doubt this, how else do you explain the massive bailout that occurred 2 weeks ago or so by a Republican president and a Democrat-controlled Congress? How do you explain it? All the protestations to the contrary, you knew what these people were going to do in the end. You knew that they were going to sell you out to their masters. And they did. And they will sell you out again and again and again until you stop allowing yourself to be sold out.
Stand together, brothers. Your fight has just begun. Your flag still calls for freedom. Her glory's yet undone. The children ask for justice. The politicians lie. From them you'll get no answers. So rise and tell them why. Rise. Rise up, Southern brothers. Rise. Rise up, Southern brothers. It's time to call your brothers from all across this land.